In Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being, a diary written in Japanese washes up on the shores of British Columbia. The process of reading and translating the diary unfolds into a story that spans the Pacific, takes us into contemporary Japan, Zen meditation, Western philosophy, and the dark history of the Second World War. Welcome to the World Literature Podcast. My name's Ivan Stacey, and on this channel we discuss literature from around the world, delving into the places, people, and ideas brought to life in fiction, drama, and poetry. In each episode, I invite an expert to give their views on a text or author, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jerrine Tan from City University of Hong Kong. I hope our discussion inspires you to read A Tale for the Time Being, and if you have read it, please do join the conversation by leaving a comment. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Jerrine Tan, and today we're going to be discussing A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. Jerrine is assistant professor at City University of Hong Kong. She's born and raised in Singapore, holds a bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley and MA and PhD from Brown University. Jerrine, real pleasure to have you here. And before we begin, I should just say we're discussing a fantastic novel, A Tale for the Time Being. It does contain some scenes of sexual violence, and those may well come up in our conversation. Also, we'll do our best to avoid any big spoilers, and we'll try, if any are going to come up, we will try to warn you, people who are watching and listening. The story is about time, and it's kind of circular. So, this linear idea that we're going to start at the beginning, get to the end, doesn't quite work with it. So that kind of messes up the idea of spoilers, but we'll try our best to avoid them. Okay, so let's begin. Jerrine, why did you decide to talk about this novel, and why should people read it? Could you just give us a quick introduction to the text?
Yeah, I love this novel. I wrote about it for my dissertation. I'm still writing about it. I teach it often. And it's such a wild novel. Like, it's really a kind of sweeping, trans-Pacific, intergenerational, really ambitious novel that spans, continents, oceans, generations. There's magic realism, translation, we move across time and space and the internet. So it's just amazing at the level of scope. It brings so many things together. It discusses, Second World War, Japanese, both victimhood and culpability, which I'm very interested in as someone from Singapore and who, spent time in Japan researching post-war and wartime Japan. It talks about Zen Buddhism, and Ruth Ozeki herself is an ordained Buddhist priest. We find ourselves in a love hotel in Tokyo. It talks about the tsunami of 2011. It takes us to, British Columbia in Canada, to California. So it's just amazing because you get to go to some places. But also, I just love the narrator, and I've heard different things from people who've read the novel. Some people find now perhaps annoying, but I find her really fresh and endearing as this sort of 16-year-old girl who is our guide through this wild ride of a novel.
Yeah, I think wild ride is a good description, and the scope of it, as I think people who haven't read it will hopefully be excited by what you just said. And yeah, just to give the premise, it's what happens is a diary is found in British Columbia on the coast, written by this girl Nao, Nao, the transliteration of Japanese, but there is a pun on Now as in NOW there as well. So the person reading in British Columbia, who is Ruth, starts to kind of reconstruct the life of this teenage girl in Japan. And this geographical kind of setup makes it a global, or at least a trans-Pacific novel. And interesting to hear that you taught it. I'd love to teach it. I haven't so far. Where have you taught it? On both sides of the Pacific or just one so far?
Yes. Well, uh, of the across, well, I was on the East Coast, so it's not the Pacific. I taught it at Mount Holyoke College a couple of years ago, where I was
Mm,
based. And it was an historically all women's college, so it
mhm,
was kind of fun to teach it to that group of students, and they really enjoyed it, I think. It also had very strong reactions to, the content note that you provided before, right? Because
mm,
we deal with some really difficult issues. And of course, the students were also very close in age to our narrator, right? Dealing with similar kinds of, anxieties around friendships, their body.
mm,
So that was really interesting teaching it there. And then I've also taught it here in Asia, in Hong Kong, where I'm based, and students have a slightly different reaction to it. Not least because I'm now in a co-ed classroom, right? So we have,
mm,
men and women in the classroom, and I feel like some of the reaction to the novel is a little bit gendered. I sense that the women enjoy the novel a little bit more,
mm,
um, but the kind of reaction as well to some of the issues around the war, the Second World War, and how that's understood, how that's processed, how
mm,
people react to it, right? Because of course in the US there's a lot of awareness, especially now around how we think about the dropping of the atomic bomb, Pearl Harbor, um, the Japanese internment in the US, right? As
mm,
as opposed to in Asia, where that's less at the forefront of our minds. And when we think of the Second World War, unlike in the West, the villains that come to mind aren't immediately, Germany, but Japan, right?
mm,
Because of the Japanese occupation in many parts of Asia. So their understanding of some of these issues is slightly different or comes
mm.
from a different angle. So that's been kind of interesting as well, sort of framing these things for
Yeah.
different students based in different places.
Yeah, and to give some context, so Now's diary sort of goes back through the generations and actually get a second diary, which is a grandfather who was, involved in the war towards its conclusion. So
Uncle, actually, grand uncle.
is it uncle? Okay, get my family trees mixed up. I mean, it I suppose it's quite sympathetic towards the characters who are represented. So, I mean, did have students you've taught had a problem with that aspect of it, feeling it sort of paints Japan in too positive a light, or is it more a response to the personalities of the characters that they had a problem with?
Um, no, I don't think students have had like a negative reaction to these
Mm,
stud characters being portrayed sympathetically, because they are such full characters, right? So
mm,
you really understand them as characters rather than, a kind of faceless soldier in the war, and therefore a representative or a symbol for the Japanese Imperial Army or something. It doesn't
mm,
quite feel that way. And also because I think Ruth Ozeki does such a great and important job of demonstrating how these individuals also suffered under um, Japanese imperialism, right? That
mm,
that there were Japanese soldiers who were drafted who also opposed the war, and that's who the character is, right?
mm.
So we're not seeing, kind of like a evil
Yeah.
aggressive representation of these individuals, but individuals who represent that history, but something counter to that. And I think that's interesting. I've never taught it in, say, Japan, but I wonder
Mm.
what the reaction to it would be there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it would be interesting to know if yeah, people have taught it there and how it's received for sure. Yeah. Um, just to go back to you talked about responses to Now as narrator. I'm with you. I found her, endearing and as a narrator very readable. I was actually surprised. I think I first read it a couple of years ago, came back to it recently, and in my memory, it was this really sort of light, light story that ticks along and you read it, and then went back to it and the content's really dark, in parts, and particularly the way now is treated. She's bullied at school, for example. Um, I mean, did you get the same sort of feeling when you read it? Yeah, I've described it as light. Maybe that's not quite the right term, but now has a very chatty style, right?
Mhm.
Did you get the same feeling when you were reading it? And how do you reconcile that with the content, which is really quite disturbing on, or brutal on a personal level, but also historically as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, I love her as a character, but I think that there's also something that Ozeki is doing in her choice to use such a character and such a voice for now, which implicates the reader in several ways at several levels.
Mm,
So, I mean, yeah, you're right about that chatty style, right? The novel literally opens with her voice, right? Which we
yeah.
later come to realize is a sort of metatextual voice because she's not speaking to us. We're hearing sort of Ruth represent now to us, right? Because
Yeah.
we're reading from her diary. So that kind of multi-layeredness to the narration is really interesting to me as well. Like she says, "Hi, my name is Now, and I'm a time being. Do you know what a time being is?"
Mm,
And it's so cheeky and childish and cute,
mm,
right? And she's really kind of establishing a reader-writer relationship, which I think is what the novel is really interested in novelistically, right?
mm,
Um, and I think what Ozeki is really interested in because she talks in interviews about putting herself in the novel. I
mm,
think she was writing around something else at the time, and then the tsunami happened, and she felt like, she had to enter the novel, right? She had to
mm,
participate. So I think that narrative voice is really a way for her to experiment with this idea of participating in the world,
mm,
right? Even in the face of difficulty and disaster and so on. And it is out of that relationship that Ruth, the character in the novel,
mm,
and now establish that, some of this intergenerational trauma, even climate trauma, right, with the tsunami and everything, begins to be healed.
mm,
Um, and then another thing about the voice, which was for me personally very interesting because I had the great privilege and pleasure of reading the novel while I was living in Tokyo. So I
oh,
used
right.
it as a kind of
Okay.
or I used now as a guide to the city, if you
Really
will.
fantastic.
Um, yeah. So I went to the maid cafes, and I
Wow.
went
Okay.
to a love and I think that adds to the experience of the text, right? When you have that dawning realization that, oh, wait, something really dark is happening here, contrary to what I thought because of the
Mm,
tone. And I know you work on this as well, Ivan, this idea of complicity and
mm,
how the novel form can instruct us in a kind of ethics of reading,
mm,
in making us complicit, right, or making us register the ways in which we're complicit, whether implicitly through ignorance or otherwise.
mm,
um, and so I think, at various moments in the novel she discusses her fantasies around or worries around, being raped or
yeah.
um, uh, killed in a love hotel because of her sort of being a host, right? I hope this isn't a spoiler, but
Mm,
she hangs out at a maid cafe and writes in her diary, and she's asked to kind of join these men on dates. And she frames it in a kind of like cartoony, comedic way, which
mm,
I think if you're not as familiar with the environment that she's in, you could kind of take her word for it, right? But then
yeah.
there's a moment in the novel where, it's really unmasked as violence.
Yeah.
And it's on the reader to recognize that.
Yeah.
And so I had a very I had a moment such a moment of realization during my little escapades into the city using the novel as a
Mm,
map, I went into a love hotel where now goes really. So there's an area in Shibuya where all the love hotels are. So it's known as Love Hotel Hill. And I went, and indeed nobody sees you, right? You don't have to interact with any humans.
Mm,
You choose a room, the door magically opens upstairs, you go up. But what the novel doesn't say, but I suppose what people who frequent love hotels, and many people do,
mm,
would know is that the when the door closes behind you, which I didn't know, it locks and there's no getting out until you
right.
pay at a
Okay.
machine in the. So that kind of changed everything for me,
Mm,
right? That she's absolutely in a position of danger and
mm,
absolutely powerless because she's going on these dates to make a
yeah.
little money, right,
Yeah.
from the men who will pay her for
Well, I
her
mean, even
time.
her description of them as dates is highly euphemistic, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So,
yeah, and no, some really interesting points there. I mean, one point I wanted to make, the structure of the novel is that there are interleaved sections. So we get bits of Now's diary, which Ruth then reads and responds to. So you get Now's diary. I was going to say verbatim, but actually we're never quite sure. And there are footnotes that are put in, and it becomes clear these are put in by Ruth, the character. So a lot of words actually are not translated within the main text, but then you get the sort of explanation about them. And then, yeah, you get Ruth reading that bit, responding, talking to, her neighbors and her partner about it. And I mean, for me, the effect of that is we're almost reading along with Ruth, and therefore,
mhm,
it sort of replicates the experience of being taken in. Now has this chatty voice anyway, and then we're sort of next to Ruth being taken in by this, and maybe not realizing how dark some of the stuff is initially. I was also thinking of cultural exports. You think of Japan, you think of sort of manga and this sort of cute aesthetic, right? Everything looks childlike. You sort of happy music going on, which actually masks something potentially quite dark as well. And particularly, for people who are reading with those sort of images in mind, then it suddenly gets punctured, as you said, and it's almost setting that up in order to tear it down, was my feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also found myself, right, thinking about Japan and its cultural export of cuteness
Mm,
and CNI's brilliant reading of it in her essay, The Cuteness of the Avant-Garde, where once you start scratching at the surface, I mean, our aesthetic investment in kawaii or cute things
mm,
is quite twisted in a sense, right?
mm,
Where she talks about how we enjoy cute things or we find cute things so cute because they're very malleable, right? They tend to be squishy and
mm,
soft. They become cuter when they're hurt or harmed.
mm.
Um, so I think, yeah, sort of to what you just said, there's something quite dark that lies behind
Yeah.
the
So there's some
cute. Oh.
academic follow-up reading. People who want to, as good academics who want to ruin cuteness for everybody, right?
Yes.
um, Another one of the main characters we haven't mentioned yet is her. I hope I'm not going to get the relations wrong again. It's a grandmother, isn't it?
hmm
So,
Great grandmother, right? Her father's grandmother, because she's like 100 something years old,
yeah,
right?
okay. Who is a Buddhist nun up in the mountains, and this is a sort of, I guess, the one of the defining junctures in now sort of learning. In some ways, it's a Bildungsroman. She's learning to deal with the difficulties of growing up, right? And the Buddhist nun sort of helps her by teaching her meditation and these kinds of things. Um, and there's a lot of Buddhist philosophy in there as well. Um, to what extent do you think, as you mentioned earlier, Ruth Ozeki is ordained as a Zen priest, I believe the title she uses is. Uh, I mean, do you think it's kind of almost didactic in the sense of giving people a Buddhist or a Zen worldview and saying this is how to sort things out? Um, do you think you can read it and just sort of put the Buddhism to one side, if you want to? What was your take on that aspect of it?
I didn't find it didactic. I felt like it in a way animated the whole text, right?
Mm,
Because well, there's a certain belief in animism as well, I think,
mm,
in Buddhism. And so that's what guides, I think, this expansiveness of the novel, where we can't just talk about characters, we can't just talk about history or the war or um, you know, bullying or maid cafes. It's like everything, right? It's, when she imagines that she like her own death, now imagines herself like falling, her bones falling to the bottom of the ocean and coral growing on it and so on and so forth, right? And her story has to be carried by waves
mm,
um across an ocean where it's found encrusted with barnacles, and the barnacles are what um allow Ruth to figure out when
mm.
the diary was put in there and things like that. So like the whole world is implicated, right? It's like
Mm.
an entire fabric where you unhitch one stitch and everything
Yeah,
unravels, or
yeah,
you see that everything.
yeah.
Um, so I felt like that to me was where I saw the Buddhist aspect of the novel take shape. But I think the stuff about the Zazen, right? Kind of a stepping back as a way to deal with trauma. She actually was quite critical of, like, as in she's critical of the sort of passiveness, or she's kind of warning us against it, right? Where because now I think misunderstands what Jiko is telling her, what her grandmother is proposing, because her grandmother teaches her to sit zazen,
Hmm.
to clear her mind and meditate, and that will, help her. But I think what we follow in our kind of being guided by now, we see a lot of her mistakes, right? Her misunderstanding of what she should have done. And I think
Mm.
that is one such misunderstanding. And the worst climax of that in the novel is the scene with her classmates, right? When
Yeah.
there's a really awful, awful scene, extreme moment of bullying, when she kind of just says, well, I just did Zazen and went into my head and everything was okay. And I think as a reader, you're like, oh my God,
Mm.
no, not okay. Um, so I think, and there are several moments where this happens as well, right? When she gets into other bad situations,
Yeah.
with yeah, the dates and so on. And I think the reader is encouraged to understand that passivity, right,
Mm.
acceptance is not necessarily key, right? That's not the kind of peace that we're seeking that will be healing.
Mm.
And I think that Ozeki offers an alternative where that's what I meant by my reading of her saying I had to step into the novel, right? So show them passivity in these moments. So while she kind of brings up some of these Buddhist practices, I don't think it's always necessarily like didactic or encouraging of
Yeah.
it in all cases.
Well, and I mean, in other cases, now actually becomes quite vindictive towards a couple of her classmates, and she talks about developing a superpower. Um, but
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
know, is bully somebody even weaker than her at one point, which is not the aim of Buddhism, right? So there are definitely warnings there that this can be, appropriate and misused. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, so it's not. I refer to it as a kind of turning point in her life, but it's not as if she goes up to the mountain and everything is suddenly fine. And there are definitely warnings about the possible misuse of
Mhm.
these teachings. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. I think that's like another moment is when she misunderstands, um, how she should feel about her uh grand granduncle, right? Haruki number one. When
mm,
at first she's like, oh, he's a real hero, and my dad is trying to kill himself, but this guy really died, and he died as a war hero,
mm,
right? Like she thinks that for a while, and I think by the end of the novel, she comes to a revelation that well, I mean that wasn't his position, right? He was quite a different kind of soldier.
Mm,
And I think that's part of the work that Ozeki is doing as well in providing a corrective to some of this revisionist Japanese history, because a
mm,
lot of this is taught in Japan. And I mean, Japan also hasn't, really acknowledged or apologized for many of the war crimes that
mm,
happened during the Second World War, right? So the figure of the comic not that kind of robotic automata that we're used to seeing, right? That kind of legitimize the use of the atomic bombs on Japan,
mm,
part of the kind of narrative that legitimized such excessive use of force. But, focuses on individuals, right? Lots of scholars and young men who were, in university at the time and, you know, didn't want to fight the war and were drafted and sent, especially for the special attack unit
mm.
that was towards the end of the war, when the Imperial then drafted these scholars and students into the war.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's a good time to take a break. So we'll finish this section now. Please do join us for the next part when we'll continue our discussion of A Tale for the Time Being.